Hey, welcome to the shop. Today we're going to go over the basics of angle grinders. We're going to talk about different features of angle grinders, some of the different wheels that I use really commonly and how to use them, as well as a lot of safety aspects. Now I'm sure I'll leave something out, so this isn't a comprehensive safety video. Be sure to read your manual, do your homework, and just use good common sense so you'll be safe in your shop. Let's go ahead and talk about the different features you might look for in an angle grinder. The first aspect of these angle grinders is the size, and it's denoted by the diameter of the wheel. 4.5 inch is the most common for the beginner or hobbyist, and that's what I use myself. It's also really common among pros, but they also go up, and there are 5, 6, 7, and 9 inch wheels that you can use to be able to increase productivity a little bit in those larger units. Now, 4.5 inch works really well for me, and in the 4.5 inch angle grinders, there are 3 different types of switches. That's the next thing to look at. There's this sliding switch where you slide it and turn it on like a light switch, but they typically will turn off really easily just with the touch, the way they're designed. And that works really well. It's the most basic type. Now my favorite type of switch is actually a paddle trigger, and that's what I have on this Bauer here that I've had this for about a year. It's a pretty good grinder. Anyway, you just squeeze here, and as you squeeze, the grinder will run and it'll stop when you release. Now, a trigger like this can actually be a little bit safer because if you were to lose control or if it were to come out of your hands for some reason, it would go ahead and turn off. Now, the third type is a trigger grip, where you'll actually have a handle similar to a drill here on the back. And those are available in 4.5 inch grinders, but that's the standard as you go into larger size grinders. And once again, the grinder only runs when the switch is depressed. Now, which type is right for you is really going to be a lot of personal preference, but I really like the paddle triggers myself. The next thing to look at is the amperage of the grinder motor. This is an 11 amp motor and this is an 8 amp motor, which means this has a bit more power. That typically comes at a little bit higher price tag and a little bit more weight. And honestly, this 8 amp grinder has plenty of power for pretty much anything I do. So it's not necessary, but you know, it can be nice to have a little bit more power sometimes. Now, all of the grinders that I have are corded because I'm usually working where there's electricity available, but there are cordless options available if you find that to be more convenient. But I like the power and just reliability that I get out of having a corded tool when it comes to an angle grinder. Now let's just talk for a second about how you would install a wheel on pretty much any typical angle grinder. There are 3 different ways. The first is the wheel will have just this threaded insert on it. This is really common with wire brushes and a lot of grinding wheels, so you can just thread it right on the post without any additional hardware and you're ready to go. That's nice and simple. Now other wheels will just have a hole going right through them, which means you need to use a nut. Now when you're using a nut with one of these wheels, there's 2 sides to the nut typically. If you're using a thicker wheel, there's a little diameter that'll fit right inside the diameter of the wheel that you want to put towards it to hold it in place. Now if you're using a thinner wheel, you'll flip that nut over and then lock it in place just with the flat side there supporting the wheel. Now one thing to keep in mind is a lot of grinders will have a little adapter like this that sits flat against it. It sits up above the wheel, and you want to make sure that's sitting so that the flat side is against the wheel. So really the thing to look for is that this wheel is supported on both sides. Now before we get into each of these different types of wheels and how you'd use them, let's talk about some general safety aspects. Rule number 1 of grinder safety is to leave the guard in place. These have a little guard that goes halfway around, made out of metal that'll block any debris from coming at you, but more than that, it would protect you if one of these wheels were to get damaged and fly apart. That's definitely not something that you'd want coming back towards you. Now there are a couple different types of these guards, different depths, and some actually have some protection here on the bottom so it fully encases the wheel for cutting. We'll look at that more when we get to cutoff wheels. Now the next thing is to use the handle here. These handles are removable, they'll go on both sides, but if you have it securely in place, that gives you a really good way to grip and hold on to the tool. Now, even with that guard in place, we want to make sure that we do everything possible to prevent one of these wheels from coming apart. And the biggest thing you can do is make sure to use the right wheel for the job and use a wheel that's in good condition. Now, the wheels will have a little picture on them a lot of times showing which direction they can be loaded, right? If it can cut from the side, or if it's meant to grind down on an angle, or some actually can do both, and we'll look at those in a minute. But make sure you're using the right wheel for the job. Make sure it's a good condition. If it's been damaged damaged, go ahead and throw it out. Or if it's been out in the weather, gotten wet, that can affect some of the adhesives that hold the wheel together, so you definitely want to discard those wheels. Something else to pay attention to when it comes to the wheels is just take a quick look at the speed rating. This one's rated for 13,300 RPM. It's written right on the wheel, and this grinder runs at 11,000 RPM. So as long as the speed rating of the wheel is higher than the actual speed of the grinder, you're in good shape. One trap you can fall into is the larger diameter wheels, like a 6-inch, 7-inch wheel, will actually mount to a lot of the 4.5-inch grinders. However, those wheels are made to run at a lower speed with the specific grinder for those. So if you take the guard off, put one of those larger wheels on here, it's going to be spinning too fast, and that can be very dangerous. Now, because it's important to keep two hands on the grinder, it's going to want to move your part around, so you want to have that clamped down and secured. Now, since there's debris flying all over the place, definitely safety glasses are essential, and a full face shield is even better. I typically just use my welding helmet turned on to grind mode as my full face shield, and that works pretty well. Also, there's a lot of debris and dust that's kicked off, not just what you're grinding, but as these wheels break down and come apart, there's dust off of these that you don't want to be breathing in. So it's a good idea to wear a good respirator as you're doing this.
And hearing protection is a must-have with a loud tool like this.
And the last general safety issue that I'll mention is just keep an eye out where those hot sparks are flying. You know, those can create a lot of damage for things, or they could start a fire if they were landing on something that's flammable. Now let's go into the different types of things you might do with this and the wheels that would be best for that. Now, the first thing you might want to do with an angle grinder is to cut metal. There are a variety of different types of wheels that can be used to cut material, and like we looked at the picture on the side of it, it'll show on different grinding wheels whether it can be loaded on the side for cutting or just on the edge for grinding. Now, some can work for both, like this 1/8 of an inch or 3mm thick wheel can be used for grinding and also for cutting, but it actually makes a pretty wide cut. So if you're doing a lot of cutting, that would be a big hassle. That's why I recommend going with a dedicated cutoff wheel. These are a bit thinner, so when you cut through with this, you won't have to remove as much material. You can just slice right through. Now, as a trade-off for having that thin cut and being able to cut that way, they actually aren't made to grind on the side. They don't have reinforcement for that, so if you were to do that, it could damage the wheel and cause it to come apart at high speed, which we definitely don't want. For that reason, I usually keep a couple of grinders around so I can have different wheels for different things, depending on the job that I'm doing. But as far as these wheels go, the most common are these abrasive type wheels that have some fiberglass reinforcement through them, and they come in two different flavors. One is just flat, basically. The other is raised in the center here, which offsets the actual cutting wheel a little bit. It's called a Type 27, but you can just be aware that these both exist that'll allow you to cut at different depths down on the actual grinder. Now, another option that's available are these diamond cutoff wheels. These are a steel blade with diamonds all the way around the edge. They look a lot like wheels that have been used on tile and masonry for quite a while. However, these ones are made for metal. Now, these last much longer than the abrasive wheels, but they don't cut nearly as fast in my experience. So there's a trade-off there when you go to use one of these. Because of that, I typically still stick with the old-fashioned abrasive wheels. Now, if there's a guard with a full shroud available for your grinder, that's going to be a best practice to use when you're cutting, and that will fully enclose the wheel up inside here so that as you grind, it not only blocks some of that debris, it would contain the wheel if it were to come apart. Now, there are several different techniques that you could use to safely cut, but I'm going to tell you about the one that I think is the best general practice. Now, in order to do this, you're going to have the handle on the grinder, and it's going to be pointing in the opposite direction of, there's typically an arrow on the front that indicates the rotation of the grinder. The handle is going to be pointing backwards the other direction. You can hold the grinder and the handle like this to get a good firm grip on the tool, and then here on the bottom, you can see as the grinding wheel comes around this way, it's going to pull it like a wheel away from me, and that way if it were to get bound up, then it would pull it out of my hands rather than towards me. So I'm holding basically the body of the grinder almost horizontally. It's up just a little bit, and then I'm going to come down into it and make sure that arrow on the front is pointing down. That way it's going to be rotating. I'll see sparks generally coming towards me as I make this cut. Now, if I'm cutting sheet metal, I'll typically be able to get through just with one pass here, but I don't shove the disc all the way down in. I just poke it through a little bit, and that helps to keep things from chattering and helps the wheel to last a little bit longer. Now, if I'm cutting through a little bit thicker material, it's going to be much better to move the grinder forward and back so things don't get overheated and the wheel's able to just work its way all the way through, keeping a firm grip on the tool, but a light touch on my material. Now let's talk a little bit about grinding here. So there are two different types of wheels that I use for grinding. One is this hard grinding wheel, and the other is a flap wheel like this, or flap disc. Now let's take a look at the regular hard rock grinding wheel. Now these typically work best if you're sitting somewhere around 30 or 45 degrees to the material right here on this edge. Now these wheels work really well for removing hard mill scale off of material if you need to do that. They also work well for shaping and forming material. Now as I'm using it, it's going to be best to keep moving around and just let the wheel do its work and take a light cut as I work my way along here, and I spread out where that heat's going, and I can go ahead and shape this into whatever I want. The other option is to use one of these flap discs. Now I have an inexpensive one from Harbor Freight here. These go on sale for about $1 sometimes, so I usually pick up a few of them, and then this is a little bit higher quality one. Now there's three differences that I'll point out between them. One, you can just see how much more sandpaper is on the higher quality wheel than on the cheap one. Two, it's a different type of abrasive, right? This has aluminum oxide, where this one has zirconia, and that's going to be, it's going to hold up a little bit better and, you know, potentially cause fewer problems in my weld if I use it for weld preparation. Now, one other thing I'll point out is this one sits totally flat, where this one actually is raised up towards the edges. I'll show you what I mean. If I set it down on the table and push on it, you can see that this sandpaper sits flat when the grinder is actually at an angle, and that's really nice because when you're grinding with these, it's best to keep the whole strip of sandpaper engaged, and that'll give you a good cutting surface. And you can do that while your grinder is up at a little bit of an angle and easier to handle. Now these wheels are great because they can remove a lot of material in a hurry in a short amount of time. They're also really good if you get the finer grits, just for doing some overall surface cleanup if you need to clean the whole surface of some material. The last wheel I'll talk about is the wire brush. Now there are two different types of this. The first one is a cup brush, and this one's made to mount on and actually clean your material. You can move it back and forth on a flat surface to remove a lot of contamination in a hurry. Now the other is one that I use much more commonly for cleaning out a groove. This is a twisted wire wheel. It's often called a stringer wheel. And this is nice because it can get down in a groove, and where I'll often use it is just for removing slag off of a stick weld, especially if I'm welding with like a 6010 or 6011, where you have that flaky slag that doesn't really chunk off. That can be cleaned up really well with one of these wheels, and it's just a lifesaver for that. All right, well that's all for today. Get out in your shop, go ahead and make something and have some fun, but while you're doing it, be sure to be safe, do your homework, and use that good common sense. If you learned something in this video or liked it, let me know by hitting that thumbs up below. We'll see you next time.